She called me from the kitchen while I was still sitting at the table where we held the reception. "Harold, we need to talk about what happens next." She said it the way someone says next when they've already decided what next looks like. My son Derek was standing in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, not quite looking at me. That was the moment. I understood. My wife, Margaret, had been gone for exactly 11 days, and her side of the bed was still cold, and her reading glasses were still folded on the nightstand where she'd left them, and already Vanessa was talking about what happens next. I didn't say anything. I picked up my coffee cup, noticed it was empty, set it back down. I smiled at her the way old men smile at things they've decided not to fight. She took that smile as agreement. She always did. She didn't know about the account in Bend. She didn't know about the property on Subtle Lake. She didn't know that Margaret had spent the last 4 years quietly, carefully, methodically, making sure that if anything ever happened, I would never need a single thing from our son or his wife or anyone else. She didn't know, because Margaret knew Vanessa better than Vanessa knew herself. And Margaret had told me, "Harold, just wait. Don't say a word. Just wait." So I waited. I had been married to Margaret for 41 years. We met at a dinner party in 1983, and I thought she was someone else's wife, and she thought I was someone else's date. And by the end of the night, we had both figured out we were wrong about each other in the best possible way. She was a landscape architect. I was a civil engineer. We spent 4 decades arguing about whether function or beauty mattered more, and never once reached an agreement, which was fine, because the arguing was the part we both loved. We had 1 child, Derek. We raised him in the same house in Milwaukee, Oregon, where Margaret and I had spent the last 22 years. 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, a garden that Margaret tended like a second career. That house was paid off. It was in both our names. I want to be very clear about that, because it matters for what comes later. Derek was a good boy. I say that not to excuse him, but because it is true. He was curious, kind, a little soft. He had his mother's eyes and his mother's instinct for wanting everyone to be comfortable. That last part was the problem, because Vanessa was never comfortable, and Derek spent 14 years trying to fix something that couldn't be fixed, and in the process he let her reshape him into someone I sometimes didn't recognize. I knew Vanessa was trouble the second year they were together, not because she was cruel outright, but because she was strategic. She knew exactly which conversations to have and when to have them. She knew how to make Derek feel like her unhappiness was his responsibility. She called it communication. I called it something else, but I was always careful not to say that in front of my son because I knew he would have to live with her long after whatever I said passed. Margaret saw it too. We talked about it late at night sometimes, in that quiet way couples talk when they don't want to give a worry too much weight. She'd say, "Derek will find his footing eventually." I'd say, "I hope so," and we'd leave it there. What we did not leave to chance was our finances. 3 years before Margaret got sick, she started working with an attorney named Sandra Pruitt in Eugene. Margaret didn't tell me everything right away. She showed me things gradually, the way you show someone a view by opening blinds one at a time. There was the original house in Milwaukee, yes, but there was also an investment account she had built over 12 years from consulting work she'd done on the side. Money she earned on top of our household income and handled herself. By the time she showed me the full picture, it was $340,000. She had it structured in a way that was hers alone, and upon her passing, it transferred directly to me outside of any probate process. And there was the property on Subtle Lake. Margaret's grandmother had left her a parcel of land in the Cascades decades before we met. A half-acre with a small cabin that had been in her family since the 1950s. Margaret never sold it. She held it quietly, paid the property taxes from her personal account, never mentioned it in any family conversation. When she redid her estate planning with Sandra, she placed it in a revocable trust with my name as sole beneficiary. It was assessed at just under $180,000 by the time she passed. She told me about all of it in the spring before her diagnosis. We were sitting on the back porch watching the garden. She handed me a folder and said, "I don't want you to ever be in a position where you need something from someone who doesn't really want to give it." I asked her why she was thinking about this. She said, "Because I'm practical. I knew she meant Vanessa. Neither of us said the name. Margaret was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in the fall. She fought it the way she did everything, with total focus and very little drama. She died on a Wednesday in March, in our bedroom, with the window cracked the way she liked it and the smell of the garden coming through. Derek was there. I held her hand. Vanessa was in the living room. The funeral was the following Saturday. People came from all over. Margaret had touched a lot of lives. Her colleagues from the landscape firm, old friends from the neighborhood, a woman named Eloise, who had been her closest friend since college, and who cried harder than anyone, and somehow made everyone feel better for seeing it. Derek stood beside me at the reception, and for a few hours he was just my son again, the boy I recognized, and I was grateful for that. Vanessa spent most of the reception on her phone. 2 weeks after the funeral, she sat me down at the kitchen table. She had made coffee, which I noticed because she did not usually make coffee for me. She sat across from me with her hands folded and a look on her face that she probably thought was sympathetic. Derek leaned in the doorway. I remember the refrigerator humming. I remember the garden outside the window, green already because Oregon in April doesn't wait for grief to finish. She said, "Harold, Derek, and I have been talking, and we think it would make more sense for everyone if you thought about downsizing." I looked at her. I looked at Derek. He was looking at the floor. "This house is a lot to maintain," she said. "The yard, the upkeep. You're 72 years old. It might be easier, more comfortable, for you to be somewhere smaller. An apartment, maybe. Or," she paused here in a way that told me she'd rehearsed this, "there are some really lovely communities, retirement communities, where you'd have support and—" I said, "Vanessa, this is my house." She nodded. "Of course. That's why we're asking you, not telling you. We just think, this is my house," I said again. "Margaret's name is still on the deed next to mine. My name is on the mortgage we paid off in 2019. This is my house." She looked at Derek. He looked at the window. She looked back at me with the expression shifting slightly, the sympathetic one sliding off and the real one settling in underneath. "We were thinking," she said, "that since Derek is your only family, and since he and I don't have a lot of room in our apartment, it might make sense to talk about transitioning the property for estate planning purposes." There it was. I had been waiting for it, and I still felt something cold move through me when I heard it. "Estate planning," I said. "It could save a lot in probate," she said. She had done her research. I said, "I'll think about it." I picked up my coffee cup. I drank. I watched the garden. After a while, she stood up and started clearing the cups in a way that said the conversation was over and had gone the way she intended. That night, I called Sandra Pruitt in Eugene. I told her what Vanessa had said. Sandra said, "Harold, they can't do anything without your signature on a deed transfer. You own that house." I said I knew that. She said, "Don't sign anything. Don't let anyone pressure you. And if things escalate, call me immediately." I said I would. I did not sleep well. The next few weeks had a pattern to them. Vanessa would come by, sometimes with Derek, sometimes without him, always with a new angle. She brought a real estate agent once, a pleasant young man named Brandon who had clearly been told very little about the actual situation, and who spent an uncomfortable 40 minutes walking through the house, while I followed him room to room, saying nothing. He assessed it at $620,000. He left looking confused. She had contractors come to look at the garden, telling me the landscaping was overgrown and reducing curb appeal. The contractors were polite. I thanked them and told them I would consider their estimates and watch them leave. She started talking about my driving. "The road's up here, Harold. Have you thought about whether it's still safe, at your age, to be driving that distance to the grocery store?" She said it at dinner one Sunday with Derek nodding slowly. I told her my last physical included an eye exam, and my doctor had no concerns. She smiled. Derek refilled his glass. Then one Thursday in May, she called me with a different tone altogether. "Harold, I've been talking to a senior transition specialist." She said it like it was a normal sentence. "She works with families in exactly this kind of situation, helping aging parents move into the right environment while protecting assets for the family. I think you should meet with her." I asked what a senior transition specialist was. She helps coordinate the sale of the primary residence and the placement into a facility. I said, a facility. A community. She corrected herself. I said, Vanessa, I appreciate your concern. I did not say it warmly, but I am 72 years old. I am in good health. I am not confused, and I am not going to a facility or a community. I am going to stay in my house. I said my house very clearly. She said, Derek thinks it might be time to have a real conversation about power of attorney. I held the phone for a moment. I said, put my son on the phone. There was a pause. Then Derek came on, and he sounded like a man who had been convinced of something he wasn't fully sure about, which is its own specific kind of sad. He said, Dad, we're just worried. I said, are you, or is she? He didn't answer right away, and the pause was its own kind of answer. I said, Derek, I need you to listen to me carefully. I love you. I have always loved you. But what your wife is trying to do is not worry. What she is trying to do is take something that isn't hers and isn't yours yet. And I need you to decide, clearly and on your own, what side of this you're standing on. He said, Dad, you're being dramatic. I said, okay, and I hung up. I called Sandra the next morning. I told her about the power of attorney comment. She said, Harold, you need to be aware that without your consent, they cannot establish power of attorney. You are competent. You have no diagnosis that would allow a court to override your autonomy. They are bluffing. She also said, I want to make sure your other assets are properly documented and protected. Nothing should be reachable from the pressure they're putting on you over the house. I said the account in Bend was held in a structure that didn't attach to the house at all. She said, good. I said Margaret had thought of everything. Sandra said, she really did. June came. Derek stopped calling as often. Vanessa had clearly decided that warmth wasn't getting her anywhere, and distance was the next tactic. I recognized it because it is the oldest kind of leverage, the threat of absence from people who know you'd rather have them present, even when they're difficult. She was betting I'd get lonely enough to compromise. I did get lonely. That part I will admit. The house was large and quiet in a way that houses only get when the person who made them home is gone. I would sit at the kitchen table, where Margaret and I had eaten 41 years of breakfasts, and I would drink my coffee and look at the chair across from me and feel the empty space of it in a way that had weight. I missed her the way you miss a habit that organized everything, and I was learning how to move through a day that had no center anymore. But loneliness is not the same as weakness, and I had promised Margaret I would wait. In July, Derek came alone. He came on a Sunday afternoon and knocked before he used his key, which was new, and he sat at the kitchen table, and he looked at me for a long moment before he said anything. He said, Dad, Vanessa thinks we should list the house. Just like that, past the asking stage. I said, does she? He said, she thinks, with the market the way it is, we could get good money, and you could move somewhere easier to manage, and we could. He stopped. He looked at his hands. I said, Derek, does your name appear anywhere on the deed to this house? He said, no. I said, does Vanessa's name appear anywhere on the deed to this house? He said, no. I said, then I would like you to explain to me how she thinks you can list it. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, she thinks if we petition the court, given your age. He stopped again. I said, given my age. He said, Dad, I'm not saying I agree with her. I said, Derek, the moment you stopped disagreeing with her was the moment you agreed with her. I don't know when that happened, but it happened a while ago. I wasn't angry when I said it. I was tired. I think you should go home. He left. He didn't say goodbye from the door the way he used to. I sat in the kitchen until it got dark. I thought about the boy he had been, 6 years old, bringing me rocks from the driveway because he thought they were beautiful and wanted to show me. I thought about teaching him to ride a bike in the parking lot of the elementary school. I thought about the man he had become, and I tried to separate Derek from the worst of what he was doing and locate the place where he'd gotten confused. I thought about what Margaret would say. I knew exactly what she would say. She would say, Harold, you've enabled this your whole life. Both of us have. We made it too easy for him not to learn consequence. And she would be right, because she was almost always right, and I had spent 41 years knowing it. We had never said no to Derek when we should have. She paid his rent when he was 26 and should have been figuring things out. We gave him money for the car and then for the down payment on the apartment he and Vanessa bought in 2018. We never let the floor rise up to meet him because we were always there with our hands out underneath. And you can love someone completely and still have taught them something terrible by accident. I sat with that for a while. In August, I got a letter from a law firm in Portland. It was an inquiry on Vanessa's behalf about the process for establishing a conservatorship. The letter was written in careful language designed to sound like concern. But what it was, plainly, was a threat. I forwarded it to Sandra within the hour. She called me that evening and told me this was a serious escalation. She told me that a conservatorship petition requires a court to find that an individual is unable to manage their own finances or personal decisions, and that the bar for establishing this over an objecting, competent adult is high. She said, "They are trying to frighten you." I said, "I was not frightened." She said, "Good, because here is what we're going to do." Over the next 3 weeks, I had 2 appointments with my physician, who documented my cognitive health, my physical health, and my consistent decision-making capacity in my medical records with the specificity I asked for directly and paid for out of pocket. I had a meeting with Sandra and a second attorney who specialized in contested conservatorship cases. I prepared a formal written statement of my wishes, my financial standing, and my full legal ownership of the Milwaukee property. I had it notarized. I had it countersigned. And I made one more call to my accountant in Salem to verify that the investment account Margaret had established in Bend was fully shielded from any lien or claim that could arise from the Milwaukee property or from any legal action tied to it. He confirmed it. He also told me the account had grown over the past year, and the current value was just over $380,000. $380,000 that Vanessa did not know existed. A piece of land on Subtle Lake that Vanessa had never heard of, and a house in Milwaukee that she could not touch without my signature. I looked out the kitchen window at Margaret's garden. The dahlias had come in late that summer, which Margaret always said meant a long fall. I didn't know if that was true or if she had made it up, but I decided to believe it because I wanted the fall to be long. In September, Vanessa sent Derek to the house with a printed packet of real estate listings, comparable properties in the area, a highlighted market analysis, a note in her handwriting that said simply, "For your consideration, Harold." I set the packet on the kitchen counter and made tea. Derek looked around the house while I made tea. He looked at the garden through the back window. He looked at the photos on the wall, the 41 years of them, vacations and Christmases, and the one from the summer we rented a cabin in Montana where Margaret is laughing at something, and I can't remember what, but I have looked at that photo for 30 years and felt glad every time. He said, "She's really gone, isn't she?" I said, "She's really gone." He sat down at the table. He didn't push the packet. For a while, we just drank tea, which is the closest Derek and I have ever come to a formal peace treaty. Before he left, he said, "I'm sorry, Dad, about the letter, about the attorney." He said it quietly, not the way someone says sorry when they've worked it out with their wife first and need it to accomplish something, but the way someone says it when they've been carrying it and they're tired. I said, "I know you are." I did not say it was okay, because some things are not okay even when you understand them, and I have gotten old enough to know the difference. In October, I called a moving company, not because I was leaving under pressure. I want to be clear about that. I called them because I had made a decision on my own schedule, in my own time, for my own reasons. The house in Milwaukee was 4 bedrooms and 32 years of accumulated life, and I was one person now. And Margaret was right that it had more stairs than my knees preferred, and I had been thinking about Subtle Lake. The cabin on Subtle Lake needed work. Margaret had kept it up well over the years, but it had been a while since anyone lived there full-time. I drove out there on a Tuesday, a 2-hour drive into the Cascades, and I walked through it alone for the first time. It sat at the edge of the property with the lake visible through the pines, and in October with the trees gone gold around the water, it was the kind of beautiful that sits in your chest. Margaret had known. Of course she had known. She kept this for 40 years and never told anyone because she was keeping it for exactly this. I hired a contractor named Phil who came recommended by a man in Sisters whose opinion I trusted. Phil walked through the cabin with me and told me it was solid, needed new flooring in the back room and updated electrical and a proper deck because the old one had softened, but the bones were good. I said the bones were all I needed. We shook hands. I listed the Milwaukee house in November. I did not tell Derek or Vanessa until the day I signed with the agent. My agent was a woman named Carol, who had sold 3 houses on that street over the past decade and knew exactly what it was worth. She told me the market was favorable. She said we could expect strong offers within 2 weeks. I texted Derek the day the listing went live. I wrote, "I've decided to sell the house. It's listed as of today. Carol Neiman is my agent and all inquiries should go through her. I wanted you to know." He called within 4 minutes. He said, "Dad, we didn't. When did you decide this?" I said, "A while ago." He said, "Where are you going to go?" I said, "I have a place." There was a pause. Then, Vanessa's voice in the background, low and fast, asking him something. He came back and said, "Is there any equity we could?" I said, "No." He said, "Dad." I said, "Derek, the house is mine. The proceeds from the sale are mine. I'm going to be fine. I'd like you to trust me the way sons trust their fathers." I said it without any edge in my voice because I meant it, and I wanted him to hear the meaning and not just the words. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Where are you going?" I said, "Subtle Lake." Another pause. "Grandma's cabin?" "Your mother's cabin," I said. "She left it to me. I'm going to fix it up." I heard him exhale. I don't know exactly what that exhale contained. Relief, maybe. Something that might have been shame. He said, "That's a long way out." I said, "I know. I'm looking forward to it." The house sold in 9 days. We had 4 offers and I accepted the third one. Not because it was the highest, but because the buyers were a young couple with a toddler and a dog, and the agent showed me their letter, and they wrote that they loved the garden and intended to keep it and expand it, and I thought Margaret would have liked that. I said yes before Carol finished her sentence. The closing was in December. I signed the papers on a Thursday morning at a title company downtown, and Carol handed me the final settlement check, and I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes afterward, looking at the number on the paper. The house sold for $628,000. After commission and fees, I cleared just over $590,000. I deposited it the following Monday into the account in Bend, which now held just over $970,000. Vanessa did not know about the account in Bend. Vanessa did not know about the cabin on Subtle Lake. Vanessa had spent 8 months trying to take from me the one thing she knew about, and she had not succeeded, and I had walked out with 3 times what she thought I had. I drove to Sisters that afternoon and stopped at a diner called the Depot and ordered a hamburger and a piece of pie and a cup of coffee, and ate all of it at the window, looking at the Cascades. A woman at the counter asked if I was new in town. I said I was moving out to the lake. She said, "Lucky you." I said I was beginning to think so. Phil had the cabin ready by February. New floors, updated electrical, a proper deck that runs the full length of the back of the house facing the water. He added a second wood stove because I told him winters at the lake could surprise you. He put in a good kitchen because I told him I had learned to cook late in life and intended to take it seriously. When I walked through it the first time after completion, I stood in the main room for a long moment and felt something I had not felt since March, which was the feeling of being somewhere that was mine. I moved in on a Saturday. I had very little. I had brought the things that mattered: the photos, the books, Margaret's reading glasses, which I had finally moved from the nightstand and wrapped in a cloth and packed in a box, because I wanted them with me even if I wasn't sure why. I had brought the rocking chair from the porch in Milwaukee, which Phil helped me carry out to the new deck, and the first evening I sat in it with a glass of whiskey and watched the light go off the lake and felt something very close to peace. My neighbor across the water, a retired dentist named Gene, rode over 2 days after I arrived with a jar of honey from his hives and an invitation to go fishing, And I said yes to both. And we have been fishing at least once a week since. His wife, Lorraine, makes a brisket that she brings over on the first Sunday of every month, and I bring wine, and the three of us sit on the deck until it gets cold. It is a quiet life. I am learning that quiet is not the same as empty. Derek called in March. He called from his number, not a joint call with Vanessa, which I noticed. He said he had been thinking about things. He said he was sorry, not the October sorry, but a deeper one. The kind that costs something to say. He said, I've been going to therapy. He said, individually, not couples. I needed to figure out some things. He said, I let her use me to do things I knew weren't right, and I told myself it was because I was worried about you. But that wasn't actually it. I listened without interrupting, which is something I have always been bad at. He said, I don't expect anything from you, Dad. I just needed you to know that I know. I said, I appreciate that. He said, can I come see the cabin sometime? I said, yes. Come when the fishing is good. I'll ask Jean when that is. He laughed. It was his actual laugh, the one I recognized, and it had been a long time. I am not going to tell you that everything is repaired. Some things crack in a way that leaves a mark even after you fix them, and a father who has watched his son turn toward someone else's agenda and away from his own decency doesn't forget that in the space of one phone call. But I believe in the possibility of Derek finding his way back to himself, and I believe that is worth holding the door open for, even if I'm not going to do it with my hands wrapped around anything that can be taken from me. Vanessa and Derek are in couples therapy now. Derek told me that on a later call. He said things were complicated. I said life is complicated. He said he knew. I have a financial advisor now, a woman in Bend named Kim, who I meet with every quarter. The account is managed conservatively, which is what I asked for, because I do not need it to perform miracles. I need it to be there. Kim sends me a quarterly summary, and I read it at the kitchen table with my morning coffee, and I think about Margaret, who spent 12 years building something quietly and without fanfare, because she loved me, and because she was practical, and because she saw things clearly. She saw Vanessa clearly. She saw Derek's softness and knew what it was vulnerable to. She saw that I would need something solid under my feet when the ground shifted, and she built it for me piece by piece, and then handed me a folder on the back porch on a spring afternoon and said, I don't want you to ever be in a position where you need something from someone who doesn't really want to give it. I think about that sentence a lot. I think about the care it took to say it, the 41 years of knowing each other that made it possible to say it plainly without cruelty or fear. Last month I drove into Bend and spent an afternoon walking around the art center downtown. They were hanging a new exhibit, large format photographs of the Oregon coast, and I went through slowly, the way you go through things when you are not in a hurry, and I stopped at a photograph of a beach near Cannon Beach with the light coming through the clouds in that particular Pacific Northwest way, flat and silver and full of depth. Margaret loved the coast. We used to drive out there in October, off-season, when the beaches were empty and the wind came in hard and cold, and you could stand at the water and feel very small and very alive at the same time. I bought the photograph. I hung it in the main room of the cabin above the fireplace, where I can see it from the kitchen table. Some mornings, I wake up early and make coffee and take it out to the deck before sunrise, and the lake is completely still, and the sky goes through colors that don't have names, and I sit in the rocking chair from the old porch, and I think about how strange and various a life is. How it can hold 41 years of marriage and one son and a house with a garden and an account in Bend and a cabin in the pines and a letter from a law firm designed to frighten you and a check at a title company and a jar of honey from the man across the water and a photograph of a coast your wife loved. How it can hold all of that and still have room left, which is the thing that surprises me most. The room that is still there, the room that is mine. I do not spend much time thinking about Vanessa anymore, not because I have forgiven her, exactly, but because she is a small thing in a life that turned out to be larger than she imagined, and larger, honestly, than I imagined too. She wanted what she thought I had, and she never knew she was looking at the wrong room. The thing worth having was never the house. It was the 41 years inside it, and those belong to me in a way that requires no deed, no signature, no attorney, no court. Margaret taught me that. She taught me most of the things I know that matter. I keep her glasses on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, where I can see them when I do the dishes. Some habits you keep because they were always good habits. Some you keep because the person who made them possible is gone, and the habit is the closest thing you have left. Gene came by yesterday and asked if I wanted to try the north end of the lake. He said the fish had been moving that direction, and his contact on that side had been having luck. I said yes. I told him to come by at 6. He rowed back across, and I stood on the deck and watched the water and thought that this, here, was what it looked like when a woman who loved you spent 12 years making sure you would be all right. I am all right, more than all right, and I kept quiet, the way she told me to. That was the part she said would be hardest, and she was right about that too. But I kept quiet, and I am still here, and the cabin is warm, and the lake in the morning is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen on an ordinary day. She would have loved it.